I think this one's on it.
No,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Otherwise they can't hear you.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
What's picking up? Can you make sure the no, that's all. They're real. Yeah.
Testing, testing. Testing the mic.
Okay. Are you gonna have your presentation from the beginning? And then I'll throw your thing up there. Okay, perfect.
I mean, it doesn't matter. Something's up there.
You can solve the open page.
I'm gonna.
Yeah. We are streaming, so you're good to go with your mic and everything.
Should we leave the door open? This guy. Let me welcome all of you to the Americas Forum in cooperation and coordination with the Georgetown Americas Institute. Thank you, Alejandro, and the Center for Latin American Studies, whose room we are in many ways, for allowing us to invite and present the book Mexican Watchdogs, The Rise of a Critical Press Since the 1980s, which I gather today is the official publication presentation day. So this is as new and on time as a book presentation can be. This is Andrew Paxman's third or fourth visit to Georgetown. I mean, I run into him. We bounced off each other at conventions, and I was Calientes in other places. But he was here in 1990 and in 2000 to present his amazing co-authored entrepreneurial biography of Emilio Azcárraga and the rise of Televisa. Might have actually been presented in this very room, possibly. Something arranged by the wonderful John Bailey, now retired, but well remembered here. He was back for other programs, but we're really pleased to welcome him now. To get a little bit formal, he is a professor at CIDE, the Centro de Investigaciones y Docencia Económica, which has a base in Mexico City, but a wonderful Northwestern center in Aguascalientes, where I had the wonderful joy of going to a conference several years ago. Again, by the way, error in the introduction. I just invented his role with the Financial Times. He was a journalist for many people, and it made perfect sense to me that he must have worked for the Financial Times to write the book for Azcárraga. So if you want to join me in misremembering that, you're welcome to, though he's actually happy to say that while he wrote that, he was mostly working for Variety, doing entrepreneurship in the world of entertainment and the like. He then went and got, an MA at Berkeley, PhD at the University of Texas, where he worked with my pal, and many of you have read Jonathan Brown over the years, so he's a Jonathan Brown.
Jonathan and also Mauricio Tenorio.
And Tenorio, yes, in Austin. And then moved on, taught briefly at a small school in Mississippi. Wasn't big enough to contain him. I'm teasing. I hear rumor it wasn't a wonderful stop, and we'll just leave it at that. And has since
Take my duty.
been at CDE. He has published an amazing second entrepreneurial biography called Jenkins of Mexico, How a Southern Farm Boy Became a Mexican Magnate, on how William Jenkins went to Mexico before the revolution, became a major sugar planter in southern Puebla, but on the edges of Morelos, where our pal Zapata hung out, survived the revolution, came out on the other end, and if I'm remembering correctly, became a leading motion picture distributor in Mexico in the 20s and 30s. And now he has brought us Mexican Watchdogs, the rise of a critical press since the 1980s. And Andrew's going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, raising major themes raised by the new book. Then we followed, and I guess I'll do all the introductions now. Victoria Saiki. Oh, good, and we have a wonderful misprint here. How do we do that? You got to find the misprint. Victoria Saiki Serna. Shall we say, originally from Mexico, but educated in, everybody here has a near UT contact, educated from the suburbs of Austin, Texas, went on to Rice University, where she was editor of the Undergraduate History Journal and soared to the top of her class, and came to join us in our PhD program in Mexican Latin American history here, where she is completing an amazing set of studies on the interplay of political power, political opposition, rural insurgencies, and an emerging drug economy, all in the context of U.S. power trying to, how will I put it, pretend that they're dealing with a democracy while they're struggling every day to keep a bunch of authoritarians in power. And so she's going to be the first commentator, conversationalist here. I may say a few words, but my hope is to open the conversation to all of you in time to make more open conversation. So, Andrew, to you.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, John. Now I can hear the echo. Perhaps too much of an echo. Okay, can you hear me without the echo now? Good, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk through the main themes of my new book, Mexican Watchdogs, which is a history of the press in Mexico from the 1980s to the present. It's partly a personal project because I was a journalist in Mexico in the 1990s, as John mentioned, and so I was witness to some of the major changes that took place in the Mexican press. The book starts off with a memoir of sorts about what it was like to be an expat journalist in Mexico during the years of Carlos Salinas and the neoliberalization of the Mexican economy. And a lengthier version of that introduction is, you can read it at my website. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give a summary of the nature of the Mexican press during the better part of the 20th century, the prensa vendida, as it was informally dubbed by its critics, which persisted from the 1940s to the 1980s, beginning of the 90s. Then I'm going to talk about the Salinas sexenio and how under Salinas, through a convergence of factors, Mexican journalism experienced an apertura, an opening, a greater opportunity to be critical, to hold power to account. And then I'm going to talk about another inflection point, the presidency of Calderon, during which there was a triple threat that journalism faced in Mexico, having to do with the war, or the so-called war against the so-called drug cartels, who, as we all know, at least today, deal with all kinds of businesses, extortion, etc., not just drugs. And they're not really cartels, but we'll just call them cartels for convenience. An increase in government advertising, a kind of return to what to the predominant model of the 20th century, and the flight of the advertiser to the internet, which put Mexican media, print media especially, in a position where many of them felt they had to take that extra government advertising and the self-censorship that went with it. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about the last 7 or 8 years under President López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum. So next slide, please. Mexico's press, starting in 1896, you could say it's a slightly random year, but in 1896, the first industrial newspaper is launched in Mexico, El Imparcial. Industrial in the sense that it was mass-produced. It was produced for, I think, 5 centavos. In other words, it was able to be bought by middle-income people or even the working class. It was subsidized by the Porfirian government, which really sort of set a precedent for the Mexican press for about 100 years. With the Mexican Revolution, the Porfirian press, El Imparcial, and many others, many are subsidized by the government, others are independent, but they pretty much all disappear. And a new kind of broadsheet is launched towards the end of the revolution, El Universal first, and then El Excelsior. They're both still with us. And those of us who have written about the Mexican Revolution, of course, the big debate about the revolution is how much changed and how much stayed the same, continuity versus change. One of the continuities of the Mexican press post-revolution was that there was still a lot of political involvement in the press. In other words, El Universal had politicians among its shareholders, as did Excelsior. And they both function more or less as spokesman for the government, for the post-revolutionary government. And when they stray too far from that line, well, a takeover happens. And so they're brought back within the revolutionary fold. In 1929, the party that would run Mexico for 71 years is founded under another name, the PRI, as it's better known. And a year later, the biggest and the most powerful radio station, not only in Mexico, but in the whole of Latin America, was founded, XW Radio, by Emilio Azcárraga Vidaurreta. And his relationship with the state was a little rocky in the 1930s. But by the 1940s, with the help of a network of radio stations called Radio Programas de Mexico, that became the major news source for most Mexicans. And again, it was pro-government. Then Azcárraga and several other investors got involved in the TV industry in 1950. Their independent stations merged after 5 years to produce Telesistema Mexicano, the forerunner of today's Televisa. And as I'm sure most of you know, Televisa acted as the main sort of ministry of propaganda for the PRI for the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, which was the subject of my first book, El Tigre. So press-state relations between the PRI or under the PRI between the 1940s, when mechanisms of control are consolidated, including subsidies, I'm going to illustrate the relationship by reading a paragraph or two from my book, Mexican Watchdogs. Like almost all newspapers and almost all news magazines, the dailies persisted in their financial dependence on the government. Between the 1940s and the 1980s, when dependence was almost universal, the arrangement involved an array of supports. Most importantly, there was official advertising from federal and provincial regimes, together estimated at between 60% and 80% of a newspaper's revenues. Support also included monthly subsidies, sometimes delivered in cash-filled suitcases. Low interest loans from state-owned bank Nafinsa, reduced electricity bills, exemptions from workers' social security contributions, and a generous line of credit from state newsprint supplier Pipsa, which was also a monopoly. In other words, if you were nice to the state, you would get the opportunity to delay or defer your payments. And if you were not so nice, then you might find, I'm sorry, there's no newsprint this week. Then there were government payments to journalists, which allowed publishers to keep salaries low. Handsome retainers paid to columnists, known as igualas, payoffs to reporters covering Los Pinos, that's the Mexican equivalent of the White House, or covering the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or federal ministries and agencies. There were gifts of cars, houses, or even gas stations to those deemed most influential. Trips to Acapulco, invitations to accompany a president to Europe or a police chief to a brothel. I should parenthetically add that almost all reporters at this time were male. Electoral seasons were especially lucrative. From the campaign trail of Echeverria in 1970 to that of Salinas in 1988, assigned reporters could expect to pick up their regular embute, that's a cash-filled envelope, a campaign stipend, and a third envelope from the government of each state visited. Reporters also received a commission of between 8 and 15% of the value of the advertising they sold to the ministries they covered. In the late 1970s, when state coffers were flush with petrodollars, a beat reporter earning a measly $5,000 a year might make $30,000 more under the table. Altogether, these supports created a disincentive for periodicals to grow their readership, for higher circulation implied greater printing and distribution costs in exchange for very little extra revenue. This topsy-turvy arrangement turned Mexico's more prominent publishers into financial potentates. As the French essayist Jean-François Revel observed, they returned the favor with subservience. Or, as Revel put it, thus the press is shackled in 100 ways, and besides, it cheerfully puts up with its chains. Cheerful enshacklement is, of course, one way of defining clientelism. Next slide. So the hegemonic model persists almost without exception until the 1970s. I should say there are exceptions, and Ben Smith wrote a very good book on the Mexican press from the 1940s to the 1970s, the second half of which focuses on some case studies of media in the provinces, which did hold power to account, but they tended to be ephemeral. They tended to burn out within a few years. They were subject to persecution. They couldn't sell advertising and so forth. And it's not really until 1976, with the launch of the magazine Proceso, that a medium appears that is able to survive in the long run. And Proceso is still with us. The Proceso was founded by Julio Scherer, who had been editor of Excelsior. He was ousted in a President Echeverria-engineered coup in 1976. And within a few months, he managed to put out the first issue of this magazine. And it did a very good job of holding power to account. This is one of its most celebrated numbers in late 1982, just before or just after López Portillo had announced the nationalization of the banking sector. There was a feature on los tres mansiones inquietantes, the three uncomfortable mansions, so to speak, including that of the president himself. They were exposing the fact that he had a vast mansion built for himself on the edge of Mexico City, another by Hank, who was mayor of Mexico City in Connecticut, and the chief of the Mexico City Police, Durazo, was building a Parthenon-style mansion for himself in Zihuatanejo. Of course, there were several hundred people who left Excelsior in sympathy with Scherer in 1976, and not all of them could fit in Proceso. So some of them a year later founded Uno Más Uno, which for several years was the best newspaper in Mexico, and again did a good job of telling telling readers what was really happening in Mexico, including the emergence of a left-wing faction within the PRI headed by Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, which is the sort of thing that would have made the news in other newspapers, but it would have been buried on an inside page. They splashed it on page one. And then in 1984, at the end of this period of the first wave of civic journalism, this is a term from Sally Hughes's book, Newsrooms in Conflict, La Jornada, which I'm sure you're familiar with too. Thank you. Now, when Salinas comes in 1988, there is a what I call a Salinas watershed. There is a fundamental shift in Mexican journalism. This is not to say that independent critical journalism was not practiced before, but under Salinas we see a ripple effect. In other words, when independent media were founded before, that there tended not to be much duplication of them. They tended to be anomalies. Whereas under Salinas, you see a number of independent media being founded. You see pre-existing media moving in the direction of independent journalism, critical journalism. And there are a number of reasons for that. So first of all, Salinas is elected in what is widely considered to be a fraudulent election in 1988. So he needs to buy legitimacy. One of the things he does is he gets close to the intellectual class. Another thing he does is he seduces the press or opinion leaders within the press. And a third thing he does is he says this newsprint monopoly that I mentioned earlier, PIPSA, it's not going to be a monopoly anymore. I'm going to reduce the tariffs on newsprint from Canada, so you can buy newsprint at will. We're not going to use PIPSA any longer as a sword of Damocles over the heads of publishers. And this is the one. I mean, there are a number of factors at play here, but this in particular, the decision to do away with PIPSA as a monopoly. It still exists as a company, but it loses its status, is what persuades Alejandro Junco, the publisher of El Norte in Monterrey, to launch Reforma in Mexico City in 1993, which causes a tremendous impact in the field of Mexican journalism. And you can see that when it launches, this is the very first page. It doesn't put the PRI on page one, which was the tradition. Even La Jornada put the PRI on page one when they launched. No, it's Arrancan PAN y PRD. In other words, they are launching their campaigns for the presidency for the following year. That was their big story. A second factor is NAFTA as a political project. So Mexico starts negotiations with the US and Canada for the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1990. And part of what Salinas has to do is he has to convince Canadians and Americans that Mexico really is a democracy. And so this is a further incentive to liberalize the relationship between the state and the press. So there's already the example of PIPSA. Subsidies are reduced, cash payments are reduced. Journalists have to now pay their own way when they accompany the president on an international trip. There are a number of things. Chappell Lawson, in his book, Building the Fourth Estate, enumerates 7 specific measures that Salinas undertook to liberalize the relationship between the presidency and the press. But NAFTA is also, of course, an economic project. And this is something I began to witness. I lived in Mexico as of 1991. And when I got there, I saw how fast food, McDonald's and KFC and Burger King and so forth, that were mushrooming in Mexico. There were a large number of businesses that were coming in, even in anticipation of NAFTA entering into effect on the 1st of January 1994. Those companies all become advertisers. So the advertising pie in Mexico increases enormously during the Salinas years. And as advertisers channel part of their advertising budget, of course, most of it goes to television, which is why Emilio Escarga Milmo, son of the founder of XW Radio, becomes the richest man in Latin America, according to Forbes in 1993. But about 10 to 15% of their spend goes to print media. And so print media become less reliant on state handouts. That in turn means they are less inclined to censor themselves. So that's a really important part of the panorama. Then there are publishers like Junco or like Jorge Dow and Jorge Zepeda Patterson in Guadalajara, who together publish or launch Siglo XXI, which does a great job in holding local power to account, so effectively, in fact, that they are instrumental in the defeat of the PRI in the city of Guadalajara, and a couple of years later, the defeat of the PRI at the state level. The PAN wins the governorship of Jalisco in 1995. I cite several examples of in the book of how newspapers played a key role in democratizing at the local level. For example, by instituting voting booth observers. This is something that starts in El Norte in Monterrey in 1985, and then Zeta does it in Tijuana in 1989, which is where the PAN becomes the first opposition party to win a governorship in 1989, and Zeta was quite instrumental in their victory. Okay, and then the generation of 68. So there is a common fallacy, I like to call it, that Mexican democratization began with the student massacre of 1968. But as Eugenia Allier has put it in the title of her book, it was the movement that triumphed in the future. In other words, Mexico didn't democratize because of a reaction to that student massacre. But what did happen was that the people who survived the massacre, people who had friends who were killed at Tlatelolco, I cite the case of Humberto Musacchio, who was present in Tlatelolco Square during the massacre, went on to become or take a leading role in newspapers by the 1980s. So, you know, they were in their 20s then. By the time they're in their 40s, they're in influential positions. Musacchio was one of the 5 founder editors of La Jornada, for example. And so there's this combination of factors that produce this apertura. Some of it is top down, and some of it is bottom up, and some of it is sort of international. And as a result, we get the launch of a number of important newspapers. I think all of them, except Siglo XXI, are still with us. Thank you. 1994 is kind of a prueba de fuego for the Mexican press. You know, the Mexican press has been liberalizing, it's been holding power to account, it's been increasingly critical of the PRI, but 1994 is the year where it is a sort of a test for how well or how deeply the Mexican press has experienced apertura, because it's a year of one disaster after another. On the 1st of January, the day that NAFTA goes into effect, the Zapatistas launched their rebellion in Chiapas. A couple of months later, Luis Donaldo Colosio, the candidate of the PRI, is shot on the campaign trail. A few months after that, the number 2 guy in the PRI is shot, again in broad daylight in Mexico City. And at the end of the year, there's a devaluation of the peso. So it's a year of many disasters. And the government is not able to control the story. The government is not able to control the narrative, in part because journalists are rising to the occasion. And something that Sally Hughes points out in her book, and I go into a bit more detail in mine, is how for young journalists fresh out of communications programs, which had been mushrooming in Mexico in the 80s and early 90s, they go down to Chiapas and it's an epiphany. And they are energized by covering the Zapatistas and seeing how the army are coming in and crushing the rebellion and so forth. And so it's a kind of it's almost like a rite of passage for many journalists in Mexico covering the Zapatistas. So there are, I wouldn't say that Mexican journalism came out of this prueba de fuego with flying colors. I know I'm mixing metaphors horribly, but so be it. La Jornada, for example, was so partial towards the Zapatistas, it became a kind of a spokesperson for the movement, and tended to exaggerate the government as the villain of the story. But there was a tremendous opening of the press that was evident, and of course you didn't have to rely on La Jornada. You could read La Jornada and also read Reformer and get perhaps a more balanced perspective, and then you could read Excelsior and get the government's perspective. So, and those of us practicing journalism at the time, we did that. We consulted a number of sources. Here you have this is Reformer covering the devaluation at the end of the year. ¿Por qué vamos a creer ahora? I mean, it's sort of, they're questioning the government. Can we really believe in the government? This is Jaime Sarapuche, who was the treasurer at the time. And so it's a year that really marks, that really shows, that really proves that Mexican journalism has weaned itself off dependence, or at least largely done so, because there are some media like El Universal and Excelsior that are still big selling broadsheets that are towing the government line. I would say that this transitions into an era of a peak of press freedom. So from around 94, the year I've just described, which is also the year that Ernesto Zedillo takes over as president, until around 2006, which is when Vicente Fox steps down, we really see a free press, which is not to say that there are not problems, but Mexican journalists are pretty much at liberty to write what they want during those years. And it is during those years that the PRI is finally ousted from Los Pinos. The PRI, after 71 years of rule, is defeated by Fox of the PAN. And one could argue that two major factors of that victory were the opening of the print media, which caused growing numbers of people to question the PRI, to question the benevolence of the PRI, and also a generational change at Televisa. El Tigre, Emilio Azcárraga Milmo, dies in 1997. His son, Emilio Azcárraga Jan, the third Azcárraga in the dynasty, takes over and decides, I want to remake the company in my own image. I want to show that I'm in charge, and so we're going to have a plural news coverage. And in the midterms of 1997, this is something that Chapel Lawson goes into great detail, very persuasive detail in his book. And then again in 2000, Televisa really does open up its cameras to opposition politicians, something that hadn't done before, just the reverse. It had vilified them. And that too helps Fox get elected. One might even talk of 15 years of spring from this launch of Reformer until 2008, which is a year I will describe in a few minutes. It's a couple of years into the Calderon administration. So what happens under President Calderon? Here we see another point of inflection. Calderon, as most of you probably know, during his first month in office, December 2006, decides to declare war on all the cartels at once. And this is a policy that is initially somewhat successful. He's able to repress cartel activity in many zones of Mexico. He's able to either imprison or kill a number of capos, and the homicide rate is not affected in the short run. But then, as we know, the problem with the kingpin strategy is that when you decapitate a cartel, you often provoke factional infighting as a result. And you also provoke territorial designs or enhanced territorial designs by one cartel that neighbors the territory of the other cartel whose capo just got killed. And so the homicide rate rebounds in 2008 and zooms upward during the rest of the sexennial. And a lot of journalists are getting killed in the crossfire. I mean, sometimes literally in the crossfire, because they're showing up to cover some kind of confrontation and they get shot. More commonly, journalists are getting killed because cartel operatives don't like what they're writing about them, or they don't like what they're writing about the rival cartel. Thank you. So here we see the homicide rate for journalists, or rather not the rate, the numbers of journalists killed by decade, going back all the way to the Porfiriato before the revolution. So, quite peaceful under the Pax Porfiriana, the last decade before the revolution. During the revolution, of course, journalists are getting killed because it's war and that's what happens. There are still a number of uprisings in the 1920s, and again, journalists are getting killed. But once the PRI starts to consolidate and impose itself nationwide, you can see the homicide rate as pertains to journalists is really quite low for about 40 years. It starts to tick up in the 1970s, and that has to do with the cartels. The first cartel hit on a journalist, the first documented case, is from 1976, the last year of Echeverria, and then that rate goes up in the 80s. It comes down a bit in the 90s for reasons I don't quite understand, and then zooms up under Fox and even more so Calderon, and stays high under Peña and under AMLO. Thank you. Now, the second threat, so there's a threat of violence, increasing threat of violence towards Mexican journalists due to the drug cartels. The second threat is has to do with Calderon's response to a couple of years of bloody headlines in the press. He realizes, I have to regain control of the story. I have to regain control of the narrative. So what he does is, he comes in at the end of 2006. 2007, his advertising spend, his advertising spend, can we go back? His advertising spend comes up a bit, the other way, thank you. But it increases much more, about 34% in 2008. So here we see Calderon trying to seduce the press with government advertising, which I'll say why. I'll talk a bit more about the perspective of the journalists themselves in a minute. But you can see that the trend is generally upward. Government advertising, which was pretty high under López Portillo, Miguel de la Madrid, despite the recession, and Salinas, comes down in the second half of the Salinas years and is fairly low under Zedillo, and still relatively low under Fox, although it does creep up a bit during the midterms and again in the last year of his sexennial. But under Calderon spends $3 billion. These are peso figures, but if you convert this to dollars, it's $3 billion he spends. And then when Peña comes in, Peña Nieto in 2012 to 2018, he spends another $3 billion on official advertising. In other words, co-opting the press. And he's successful in the sense that a number of media towards the Is this okay? Yeah. Calderon is successful in the sense that towards the end of in the second half of his term, newspapers are less and less frequently putting bloody confrontations between government forces and the cartels or inter-cartel fighting on the front pages. Thank you. Why are newspapers willing to accept government cash? They know from their own histories and the histories of their rival media that this is what the government does, this is what the prehistorically did in order to maintain an official line, in order to tell lo bonito, to tell the pretty side of what the government is doing in terms of effective policy and making the president look presidential and so forth. Why return to that? Well, the main reason is because they are beginning to suffer the flight of readers and advertisers to the internet. So something that really, the year of inflection in the US has been described as 2005. In Mexico, it's a little later. In 2009, there is a recession in spend on advertising in general, and print never recovers. And in part because advertisers are increasingly comfortable advertising online, spending on Google and Facebook. So this opinion column from The Guardian in 2018 really is something that could have been written 10 years, certainly 5 years earlier, and not only in the UK or the US, but globally. And so newspapers like El Universal, which had been exercising pretty good independent journalism for a while in response to competition from Reformer, go back to towing the government line. Reformer is one of the papers that is able to maintain its independence, in part because it has a very strong business model and had one from the start. But it's not all bad during Calderon, because towards the end of the Calderon sexenio, we start to see the launch of news portals, as they're known in Mexico, or news sites. Aristegui Noticias. Aristegui is already a well-known figure on radio, but she launches her online platform, I think it's 2012. This is from Animal Político. This is one of their great investigative pieces of the Peña years about Javier Duarte Veracruz. They launched, I think, in 2011. And Sin Embargo is another one from that era, 2010, 2011. And they rank fairly well among the the most viewed news sites. López Obrador, how are we doing for time? Okay, López Obrador. So here we have a third inflection point. López Obrador comes in saying, I'm going to, in fact, even before he takes office, he says in the summer, he and Jesus Ramirez, his vocero, say in the summer of 2018, we're going to cut government advertising by 50% because it's a waste of public money. And we need to re-establish, we need to reinvent the relationship between the government and the media. And to a lot of people, that sounds like a good idea, because it's outrageous how much Calderon and Peña have been spending on the press. So they say we're going to cut it by 50%. They actually cut it by 80%, which is not necessarily a good thing, as I will get to. His second major press strategy, and the most important one, is his resumption of the Mañanera, which is a morning press conference that he instituted when he was mayor of Mexico City in 2001. He revives it as president on, I think, his third or fourth day in office. And during his presidency, he gives 1,400 morning press conferences. In other words, every day, Monday to Friday. He sometimes gives another one in the afternoon. It's an act of political genius, because it enables him to control the news agenda, or at least to largely control the news agenda. So he opens the doors of the National Palace, well, not him literally, but the doors of the National Palace are opened to the press every morning at 5 to 6 a.m. And at 7 a.m., he comes out onto his stage and he gives a press conference. And initially it was an hour and a half. And by the end of the presidency, it was more like 3 hours. And he has cabinet members come and talk. And he shows clips, he shows graphics, and he takes questions. However, while it might sound like a press conference, a number of journalists became reluctant to call it exactly that, because it became evident fairly early on that the front row of seats in the Mañanera, the front row of seats facing him, were occupied by journalists who were sympathetic to the regime, some of whom were arguably not journalists. They were more like influencers on YouTube. And as it became evident that the majority of the questions were going to these pro-government reporters, the traditional press tended to, if not stay away, they tended to be increasingly selective about how often they showed up. And so this had the effect of creating a propaganda tool that was very effective, because all the major media covered it, at least at a distance. The TV stations all had their cameras there. They would show either the Mañanera in full, or they would show clips. And journalists and commentators found themselves constantly responding to what the president has said. It was also a third important facet of his media strategy, was to disqualify critical media, even those media who had helped him get elected by exposing corruption within the PRI of Peña Nieto. So Animal Político, Reforma, Proceso, they all came to be dubbed as opponents, or even as conservative media. Proceso has always been left-wing. but they were dubbed as conservative, and there was an echo chamber online that repeated and exaggerated that critique, whereby critical journalists were dubbed as thugs or as sicarios or as vendidos, prensa vendida, chayoteros, those who are willing to accept bribes. And that was a very resonant critique for the public, because the public knew that for most of the history of the previous 100 years, most journalists had taken bribes. Whether or not the critics were taking government cash still was kind of beside the point in terms of the public narrative. And so it became quite easy for the president to disqualify criticism. To be fair, critical outlets themselves very often did not do the best job in covering López Obrador. In other words, as his rhetoric became more strident, many critics in the media became more strident too. And so you had a polarization effect taking place in the media, and newspapers, even Reforma, which was arguably still the newspaper of record in Mexico, it went through a change of editorship, which probably had something to do with this. It became less balanced in its coverage of AMLO, and left-wing columnists began to leave the newspaper. And so the columnists, you had a couple of token leftists, but mostly centrists or conservatives. And so again, it was easy that made it easier for AMLO to dub Reforma as a reactionary newspaper. With less money, because the advertisers are still fleeing to the internet, because there's less support from the federal subsidy mechanism. The investigative journalism that we saw, there was plentiful investigative journalism in the Peña years, but much less investigative journalism, much less detailed holding of governments, either federal or state level, to account in the AMLO years and today. It hasn't disappeared, but it's done less frequently, in part because it's so expensive to do really good investigative journalism. Going back briefly to the subject of vilification, here we see the number of attacks on critical journalists during the course of the sexenio. Carlos Loretta Mola, a former Televisa journalist who became a critical journalist, critical of AMLO online and on radio, was criticized by AMLO more than 700 times. In other words, every other day, on average, he was criticized by the president, by name. Ciro Gomez Leiva, another one who was highly criticized. He's actually in third place after Enrique Krause, who was also subject to an assassination attempt halfway through the sexenio. We don't quite know why, but it certainly was troubling to a lot of journalists that critical journalists were being attacked either rhetorically on social media, being savaged very often on social media, or even being subject to a murder attempt. The state of play now under Claudia Sheinbaum, she's continued the Mañaneras. I'm sorry about the misspelling, I've just seen that. But her tone is much less confrontational. She doesn't call out journalists by name. She doesn't talk about the mafia of the press or anything like that. She can be evasive, but the tone is generally much less confrontational. However, the independent press is still living very precariously because of underfunding. And so what might be done, very briefly? Historians are not supposed to talk about policy, but I'm going to do so anyway. One solution would be less vilification. Well, we've seen that from the presidency. Certain state governors continue to vilify critical journalists. An increased budget for the special prosecutor. In 2010, in response to a public outcry about the number of journalists being killed, President Calderon instituted a public prosecutor public prosecutor for cases pertaining to freedom of speech, something like that, lengthy title. And but AMLO cut that prosecutor's budget by about 30%. This prosecutor, his his objective was to explore cases, to investigate cases where it was provable that a journalist had been killed for what he, usually was she, usually was he, occasionally she, had written. About 93% of journalist killings historically have been male victims. There's a safety mechanism for journalists that again was instituted towards the end of the Calderon years, which has come under criticism for being insufficiently effective. It includes things like panic buttons and emergency numbers, and in extreme circumstances, a government budget to relocate journalists from the States to Mexico City so they can live more safely. Philanthropic backing. We've seen in the States that media that have come under tough times have been bought out by philanthropists. We all thought it was a good thing when most of us thought it was a good thing when Jeff Bezos bought the Post. Some of us have had reservations over the last 11 months. He's just one of a number of American billionaires who've bought media and helped sustain them. That has almost not happened at all in Mexico. There's one case, there's a magazine called Gato Pardo that was bought by a banker. But other than that, we haven't seen philanthropists helping support the press. The best solution, I would say, is a European-style independent subsidy body. So starting in Holland and Norway in the late 60s, early 70s, those countries realized that small-town media were in danger of disappearing unless they had subsidy backing. And so subsidy mechanisms were instituted, and they were protected against political interference. Those have since multiplied throughout Europe. I think the only countries that don't have them are my country, the UK, and Germany, because of the size of the economies. But even in France and Spain and Italy, they have these mechanisms. And I would advocate for such a mechanism here, which uses government money, but it's an autonomous body. Unfortunately, the tendency under the ruling party in Mexico in the last 7 years has been to do away with autonomous bodies. So we can but hope that there will be a change of heart from President Sheinbaum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot to think about. Pass the microphone to Victoria.
Is the audio on still? Oh, the echo. Okay.
Twice.
Well, firstly, thank you for visiting us for the third time. I think Dr. Tutino mentioned. It's wonderful to have you, and your presentation was incredibly intriguing. Since we have you here in person, can you open with a couple of anecdotes from your time as a journalist in Mexico and talk about how your experiences may have influenced the research and development process of this book?
Thank you for the question. Well, I worked at Mexican media for about 3 years. I was at a newspaper called The News, initially the Mexico City News, and The News was published by a Mexican newspaper called Novedades. It was part of Novedades Editores, and I was there for about a year and a half. And something that I talk about in the introduction to the book, which kind of galvanized me as a 5-year-old, 26-year-old, in terms of my commitment to good journalism, was an occasion of censorship at the News when a colleague of mine published a feature about Manuel Bartlett. Some of you may have heard of him. He was Minister of Gobernación under de la Madrid. He's thought to have been the man responsible for rigging the 88 election, and more recently he was head of the Comisión Federal de Electricidad under AMLO. He was running for the governor of Puebla, and a colleague of mine wrote a feature about him, about how he was a person of interest to the DEA, linked to the assassination of Quique Camarena. If those of you who've seen the first series of Narcos Mexico may recall that story. And he was a DEA agent murdered in Mexico, very grisly. And this story led to further coverage of Bartlett. Another journalist did some more digging and then found his stories were withheld. And so this became a big incident. Newsweek covered it. The journalist in question wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. in which he was basically saying, fire me if you dare. And the owner took the bait and fired him, and so it became even more of a story. And other international media began to cover this story of censorship at the news. And we're talking about late 1992, so NAFTA negotiations are going on at the time, and Salinas, his response is to invite the journalist to Los Pinos and apologize and offer to find him a new job. And so he decides, no, thank you. And he goes back to New York and becomes a star reporter on, I think, the Daily News. So that was one. And another was towards the end of my time at Excelsior. Excelsior published an English language news magazine called Mexico Insight. I was a business reporter now. And in the spring of 1994, after Colosio was shot, I think a couple of weeks later, it was announced that Ernesto Zedillo would replace him as the prize candidate for the presidency that summer. And the way that Excelsior, the parent paper of the publication I was working at, the way that Excelsior announced it was basically to print a government press release on page 1 of its afternoon edition and have it signed by a journalist. And I was so disgusted at that, it made me determined to leave Excelsior just as soon as I can. And fortunately, I was able to get a job with Variety as their Latin America correspondent, which was very glamorous.
Sounds like a very interesting time. Shifting more towards content questions, I get the impression from both the book, which I had the pleasure to read ahead of time, and your presentation that the United States has a very complicated relationship with Mexican media. On one hand, you have the NAFTA advertising opening up independence for newspapers, but you also described how Televisa news coverage slanted rightwards to align more with Washington's worldview. Can you talk more about U.S. influence on Mexican media and how that has changed over time? And also if there are any particularly impactful news reports from U.S. outlets that changed the Mexican media landscape?
Well, the U.S. began to interfere in Mexican in the Mexican media during World War II. There were a number of papers, including Excelsior, that were sympathetic to the Nazis. And so the U.S. said, if you carry on publishing pro-German material, we're going to tell all of our businesses in Mexico to stop advertising in your pages. And so that persuaded Excelsior to adopt the ally line. During the Cold War, I think I think that during the Cold War, the interference was less obvious. It was more that media owners in Mexico tended to be conservatives and tended to be cold warriors on the US side. In their pages, they may have tolerated a certain amount of pro-Soviet sympathy among columnists, for example. But that was part of putting on a kind of a plural face. And Renata Keller, who has written a book on Mexico's Cold War, describes very well how there was a policy for public consumption and that was plural and it's kind of sympathetic to Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, but behind the scenes, the Mexicans were allowing the Americans to spy on the Cubans in Mexico. So there's that. And then I think during the 90s and thereafter, well, during the 80s, there was pressure from the US Embassy on Mexican media to downplay anti-US sentiment. Mexicans tended to sympathize with the Central Americans during the civil wars of the 1980s. The news, where I worked, was lent upon by John Gavin, the ambassador during the Reagan's ambassador, to be more pro-US. It didn't like the way that the news was covering the conflicts. But afterwards, I think it's more a case of not direct intervention. It's more, again, a case of certain publishers being fairly pro-US in their sympathies, and the Escarga family too at Televisa, they were always very pro-American.
And speaking of pro-American, or more so going back in time, still leaking seems to be a particularly important practice that helps break a lot of stories, particularly when it comes to revealing the inside of the PRI machinery when it was still working in its golden age. Can you talk more about how those leaks changed over time and how you see them working now in the digital age? The Guacamaya leaks, for instance, from a few years back come to mind. How has this trajectory changed? And do you still see it as a very important practice in Mexican media?
That's a great question. Proceso, I describe Proceso as an independent, critical, investigative magazine, but it is true that a lot of their most impactful stories resulted from leaks, resulted from certain people in government either wanting to get one over a rival in the cabinet or being uncomfortable with something that government agencies were doing. So one of their most famous cover stories in 1980 was a revelation of the existence of a paramilitary group called the Brigada Blanca, which basically went into the campo and bumped off guerrillas and extrajudicial killings and so forth. That came to Proceso via a leak. And Proceso, and then when Reforma launches in 1993, a number of their exclusives come from leaks. The leak of a photograph, an embarrassing photograph of the brother of the president on a yacht with a woman who is not his wife sitting in his lap, for example. And also the leak of a letter from Ernesto Zedillo to Colosio, expressing concern about a lack of support from Salinas during the campaign. I think I'm getting that correspondence the right way around. In recent years, I think media have been less dependent on official leaks or leaks that come from within the government or government sources. I think there has been a revolution in Mexican investigative journalism. I think it began in the 90s. El Financiero was an early pioneer of investigative journalism, and then Reforma, Raimundo Riva Palacio was a key player in developing that kind of journalism. And then in this century, we've seen a lot more focus at journalism schools on things like data mining, freedom of information requests. Those become a thing as of 2002. It's not until 2002 that Mexico has a Freedom of Information Act. So there's a great response from the press to that. And I would say now, these days, it's probably a mix of the two.
A lot of those themes actually flow really well into the next question I had, which is on Aristegui Noticias, the Televisa leaks, which for those of us in the room that don't follow Mexican news as much, Aristegui Noticias, which you mentioned in your presentation, broke a series of reports detailing how Televisa still engages in misinformation campaigns, puts out bots to really ramp up certain stories. How does this report change how you view press-state relations over time? And were you surprised by how much coverage the story did or did not get?
I'm going to make a frank admission that I did not pay a lot of attention to that story because I was racing to finish the book. One of the problems of writing a book that reaches across several decades and ends now is that when you're in the process of revision, and those of you who have written academic books know that it's a lengthy process because you submit the first draft and then it goes out for peer review and then you tweak it again and it goes back and forth. And I submitted my first draft finished draft in January 2024. So that was, what's that for a gestation time? It's 18, 19, 20 months. So I was not really at liberty to do a good job. I didn't really have the time or the space because there were also space limitations. I had cut quite a bit for this book. The Mexican edition that comes out next year will be longer. And some of what I cut out will go back in.
Going back, I guess, then to the AMLO era and the propaganda machine that started to become a little more evident with the Mañanera, how do you see investigative journalism engaging with this almost post-truth landscape where the government says we have a certain amount of data or certain facts, so to speak, but then independent agencies or watchdogs come out and say, no, we have different data on whether it be journalist killings, disappearances, How can investigative journalists reckon with this moment, and how does this fit into the broader panorama of the trajectory you cover in the book?
There are a couple of people who are better qualified than me to answer this question, and they're sitting right here, Dolly Estevez and Mary Beth Sheridan, formerly of the Post. I will try. I mean, I would say that it's a global problem. AMLO, one of the expressions he's famous for, one of the unfortunate, he's famous for some really good turns of phrase. I am not anti-AMLO. But one of his phrases that I think is less fortunate is "Yo tengo otros datos." You know, I have other data, and Trump has said words to the similar effect. He says prices are going down when all the data show that they're going up, and so forth. We are at a it's a cliche to say it in a kind of a post-truth society. Although I'm not sure I would use that phrase because what we are, I think, rather more heading towards, and The Economist said this a couple of years ago, is a return to the 18th century, whereby a well-educated and fairly well-off elite are reading what is written by a fairly well-educated, well-off elite, and they are well-informed. And the rest of the population is relying on rumor and exaggeration, what you heard in the street in the 18th century and what you see on Twitter and TikTok now. So we are heading towards, and in both the US and the UK and Mexico, everywhere, or pretty much everywhere, I think, a two-tier information society.
On one of the tables that you showed on your last slides, I caught the name of Victor Trujillo, or Broso, who's a famed comedian. And I also recall from your book how you mentioned how cartoonists had a very influential role in pushing the boundaries for government critique in the press. Can you elaborate on both of their roles throughout time, and where do you see them going now in the future?
Well, Broso's kind of taken a step back in recent years. I think he's still involved with Carlos Loret in Latinos, a critical multimedia platform. But I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question? Oh, cartoonists, yes. Well, it was long said that cartoonists in the era of pre-hegemony between the 1940s and the 1980s were the most at liberty to be critical, which is very true, and they were amusing too. In some ways, cartoonists were pioneers of critical journalism in Mexico. They played a very important role. They played a role. I'll give you one, specific example. The day after the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968, Excelsior, which was supposed to be the most independent of the pro-government newspapers at the time, ran a front-page headline that was entirely in line with the government's interpretation of what happened. In other words, there had been combat between two armed sides. We know that the students were not armed, but that's what Excelsior said. However, on the inside pages, you have, among other things, you have a cartoon by, I think the cartoonist's name was Freire, and his cartoon was simply a black square. In other words, we are in mourning. And that was critical. That was perceived as anti-government at the time, although it might sound rather, not terribly provocative by today's standards. And I think what's happened in recent decades is that cartoonists have continued to play an important role, although they don't stand out the way that they used to. It's really columnists that stand out now.
Let me just step in here. Wonderful conversation. Thank you, Victoria, and again, Andrew. But I would kind of like to open this up. And as Andrew already has to a degree, we have two distinguished journalists with us today. Dolia Estevez, who, though based here, originally from Mexico, has been reporting on Mexico for a long time. Mary Beth Sheridan, who until very recently, has reported from Latin America and Mexico for I will politely say decades, but until recently was the bureau chief in Mexico City for the Washington Post. And I would just really like to, as a step to opening it to all of you, invite two of you as you wish to raise some questions, responses, etc.
Well, I also want to introduce a colleague of mine, who you've been speaking a lot about the Reforma. He's a correspondent for Reforma, Jesus, Jose Diaz Briceño, and he covers very closely what's goes on here, and so he might be able also to contribute to this discussion. I found your presentation fascinating. I don't know how you managed to put so much in 40 minutes. No, I mean, how many years? 4 or 5 decades. So that's a lot. I want to ask you a couple of things. The first thing is there, who do you say is really independent media watchdogs right now? Because I've been looking into and also I wanted to ask you, you said that that Calderon and Peña and Calderon and who's the other one? Peña Nieto were spending $3 billion billion dollars. Yes, that's a lot of money. So, and supposedly AMLO cut that down. But if you see now, you're going to the government spending portal, and you see that they're spending a lot of money. I don't know how much it is, but they're pretty much giving publicity to everybody. With few exceptions, you'll be surprised who's getting money from the government. I have not seen Reforma, I have not seen Proceso, I have not seen Animal Político. You mentioned Sin Embargo gets millions. So there's been a shift. Some of the outlets or portales that you mentioned that were independent, they have been bought literally by the government. So I wanted to ask you, do you have a better current map of who's who at this point in the media in terms of independent media and government control media through money?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Is this on?
Is the light green?
Is it on now? Okay. Thank you for the questions, Oliver. I think independence, we have to acknowledge, is relative. There is always going to be a degree of self-censorship, even if it's being reluctant to publish a rumor about some misdemeanor by a major advertiser in the paper, and we see that globally. So, and owners of newspapers who consider themselves independent all have certain friends that they don't want to see maligned, as they might put it, in the press. So I don't think there is, or there are very few completely independent newspapers or media. The Guardian, it comes pretty close because the Guardian is a non-profit and has been able to reinvent itself in its business model in such a way that so much of its revenue stream comes from voluntary contributions from readers. But that's very hard to replicate in Mexico because the Guardian has become global. It was British. It's now global. I would say that the traditional media, the print media that are still doing a good job of retaining independence are Reforma and El Universal, and they're able to do so because they have cultivated other revenue streams, or their owners have cultivated other revenue streams over the past decades. So Junco at Reforma he has other media interests. He has real estate. Ili Ortiz, the owner of El Universal, has real estate. My supposition, I don't know for a fact, but my supposition is that both of those owners are subsidizing their newspapers through their other businesses, which is fine. in terms of the portals, I haven't looked at numbers recently, but I know when I was researching the book that Animal Politico had cut its or had limited the government percentage of its advertising to about 30%. So that gave it, decent amount of leeway. I imagine it was much less under AMLO. Sin embargo, which is quite pro-government and has, sin embargo, what they've done is they've monetized their product very effectively by launching a show on YouTube called Los Periodistas, which is hosted by two of the most prominent journalists at Sin embargo, Alejandro País and Álvaro Delgado. And that has been so popular. Some of their videos have racked up 500,000 or even 1 million views. And so they've been able to monetize that, and that has helped sustain the broader operation of Sin embargo. The other extreme, you have La Jornada, which is almost entirely dependent on government subsidies. If you page through La Jornada today, you find almost no ads apart from government ads. So, and then there are small operations like Fábrica de Periodismo, Pop Lab, which is based in Guanajuato. There are other regional media, obviously El Norte and Monterrey, that are still doing good journalism. Zeta in Tijuana is a great example. In some cases, I don't know how they do it. Thank you.
Thanks. So you showed that very dramatic, first of all, congratulations on the book, which I can't wait to read. You showed that amazing graphic of the killings of journalists in Mexico and how they've gone up. And clearly there's the reporters. I mean, I think it's a theme that's not really well understood outside Mexico, or maybe even in Mexico. There's clearly some amazing journalists who have been killed by narcos like Javier Valdez. And then there's very brave, or Miroslava Breach killed apparently in some narco political situation because of her reporting, right? But then you see a lot of local journalists who are killed apparently because they write about something that makes the local mayor looks bad or something to that effect. And then there are cases clearly where reporters are there's this sort of meltdown, in my view, of local governance in so much of the country, so that you get these alliances between politicians and narcos, and some of the killings become, frankly, it's hard to know whether it's the politicians are mad at the journalists and they send their friends the, narco sicarios to get. I mean, it becomes all part of this kind of the melding of sort of governance and narcos and crime and so on. So anyway, I'm just curious, as you look at the rising number of journalists killed, like how you see the impact and how you kind of unpack that problem.
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very complicated question. And the simple answer, the one-word answer is what, among others, Adela Navarro of Zeta has called narcopolitica. In other words, there has been a fusion of narco and political interests at the state level, starting in Sinaloa back in the 70s and 80s, but now, fairly widespread. And so it's often hard to say where one ends and the other begins, whether a killing, for example, if a journalist has been exposing links between a certain local politician and the narcos and gets bumped off, well, was it the narcos who did it, or was it the mayor who did it, or was it the chief of police wanting to curry favor with the mayor? It becomes very, very complicated. What I would say is that there has been a tendency to, among politicians, particularly at the federal level, to claim that the killing of journalists, the rise in the killing of journalists, is a manifestation of our narco problem, and that problem, or that is a half truth, because there is a very long tradition going back all the way to the Porfiriato of governors either having journalists bumped off or looking the other way while their associates bumped them off. There were 11 killings of journalists during the Porfiriato. 2 or 3 of them were killed in duels. They had insulted each other and decided to see each other at dawn. 5 or 6 of them were bumped off on the orders of governors. And back then, it was pretty well known that they did it. There was a case again during the Mexican Revolution. There was a governor of Tabasco called Manuel Mestre who had a news editor bumped off, and we know he did it because in the 20s he gave an interview in which he said, "Yes, I did it." and I trace at one point the history of governor involvement in the killings of journalists, and I have a case. I go into some detail, partly thanks to the work of Kathy Corcoran, who wrote a wonderful book called In the Mouth of the Wolf, about the Duarte regime in Veracruz and its culpability in the killing, or at least the cover-up of the investigation of the killing of Regina Martinez, of Proceso. And in his case, 20 journalists were killed on his watch, and I don't know. It's hard to say if he ever gave orders, but he certainly was complicit in delaying practices in the investigations, in blaming the victim, in questioning whether the victim was really a journalist, in saying things like "pues anduvo en malos pasos," well, he was hanging out with the wrong crowd. I think that governors are sometimes directly responsible, and they're certainly responsible for setting a tone of impunity. So that is something that I think has only been looked at, anecdotally or now and then by the NGOs like the CPJ that do cover this topic very well. But I think we lack a longitudinal study of governor culpability, and it's something that I am hoping to work on myself.
Thanks. Thank you very much for coming here. I think this was exceptional, and hopefully we will have time to read the book before you come out with an even lengthier version. So
I did bring copies. Author's discount, $25.
Yeah, you said something about gestation of the book that maybe can open up a discussion of when is a book born and when is it gestated. But that's I mean a question, and you said basically when you send it to the publisher, and I guess you've been working on this for a much longer time now. So that's one question on the topic of the book. I mean, you didn't talk a lot about TV versus print. You mentioned Televisa a bit. You did not mention eventually the appearance of TV Azteca and how that, I don't know if it's there in the book and if that had an impact or not, or I mean, having another national TV chain that is private and not official, etc., might have contributed or not. Mm-hmm. And that also links us to something that you've said. I mean, the portfolio of interest of media owners generates a lot of conflict of interest in the way media is behaves, not only in Mexico, but I think everywhere. No, but in Mexico more so. So I don't know what you have to say about TV, etc. Secondly, it seems that there's, and it seems to follow from that, a significant structural issue within Mexican media. Not only vis-a-vis the government, but also vis-a-vis the private sector. No, it's not a media that it's extremely critical of the private sector either. No, I think, and I don't know. I mean, what you say in the book in terms of how the media investigates issues as corruption, oligopolistic behavior, or all of those things. You don't see a lot of that in Mexican media. And finally, I mean, I don't know if there's data on the government. I mean, you gave the budget on government publicity. I don't know if we know where that money is going. is that transparent? So that would be, is there any study and that
Yes.
try to understand exactly how the government decides
Mhm.
who to give, who to punish or not, and blah blah blah. That will be interesting. And finally, I think there's a broader reflection. I mean, on journalist killings that goes above the government, and I think it's a criticism about Mexican society as well. I mean, we have not heard the private sector really focus on this issue, as it has not been present in the discussion of 100,000 missing young people in Mexico. So there's something deeper that in other societies you would see people on the streets and many layers of society complaining about those issues that and it goes to something that you said, that we try to ring fence the problem either associated with narco trafficking. Well, I don't care if it's narco trafficking, but there's 100,000 young Mexicans disappeared. We have a problem in this society, regardless if it has to do with a narco or not.
Yeah.
The same is true, they're killing journalists.
Yeah.
So I think it's broader than the government. No, and I don't know what you have to say about it.
Thank you. Those are great questions, Alejandro. First of all, Azteca. I don't really talk very much about Azteca in the book because this book is largely about la prensa escrita. You know, it's about print and online journalism. And I did write about Azteca somewhat towards the end of El Tigre, my book on Ascarga, but obviously that narrative ends in 2000 when the book was first published. There is a book that was published almost exactly a year ago. I think it came out in November last year. It's not quite a biography, but it's a study of Ricardo Salinas Pliego, the owner of Azteca, that was written by Mathieu Taulier, who's a very good journalist at Proceso. So I would defer to that book. In terms of media coverage of the private sector, there is a section of the book, a couple of sections, in fact, where I talk about that relationship. I talk about how Carlos Slim was able to co-opt a number of media through substantial ad buys and therefore effectively buy their friendship, even at Proceso to a point. And at La Jornada, it was quite noticeable in the first decade of this century, something that Sally talks about in her book too, how many in journalism are reluctant to criticize Slim because he is such a major advertiser and they don't want to lose his advertising. But I do narrate, starting in the mid-90s, when the main business magazine in Mexico, Expansión, went through a change of ownership. It began, the first 25 years of its life, it had been a PR vehicle for the private sector, and all of its articles were puff pieces, or almost all. But when it went through a change of ownership, it had foreign owners as of the mid-90s, and then Alejandro Serna took ownership, and they cultivated a journalist called Javier Martinez Staines, who was editor, began to do very good investigative work, and that persisted through the first decade of the 21st century, and you still see it somewhat. They have less resources for that kind of investigative journalism now, but there are the business pages of Reforma did a very good job holding business to account and refusing to print corporate press releases as though they were stories, which is what other media were doing. I remember back in the mid-90s reading about Televisa, for example, in the pages of Reforma. You would read things there that you wouldn't read anywhere else. And so I think business journalism, which was absolutely awful in Mexico up until the early 90s, really did mature, and it matured online. Some very good journalists, Samuel Garcia, who runs Arena Pública, Eduardo Garcia, not related, who had a site for several decades called Sentido Común, which was then rolled into Axios. That they've all done good work, and then there's been greater attention from Bloomberg and international sources, which do a very good job covering the Mexican private sector, the Wall Street Journal too, and a lot of that coverage makes its way into the Mexican media too in translation. And I should El Financiero, yes. It's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. What it, you know, I do talk about that in the book, and I also talk about how El Financiero was one of the pioneers of critical political journalism. You know, his name struck me when I was a journalist and I would see El Financiero. I thought it was a bit of a misnomer because it also had very good political coverage. It had the best film reviewer in Mexico was in El Financiero, Jorge Ayala Blanco. So it was much more than just a financial paper. As for the private sector response to the killing of journalists and homicide in general, I think you're quite right. There's been far too little engagement, and I think perhaps the private sector, business elites have kind of bought into the narrative that that journalists who get into trouble are kind of asking for it. It's a very persuasive but unfortunate and vastly oversimplified narrative. Thank you. Oh, the desaparecidos. Yes, the disappeared. That too. It's a number of NGOs are trying to keep attention on those topics, but the NGO sector itself has been rather undercut by criticisms from the National Palace. Lopez Obrador is not a fan of civil society. He used to be, and now he seems to have largely turned against it. And so I would hope that with the less conflictive rhetoric coming out of Los Pinos under Claudia Sheinbaum, NGOs are able to sort of, revive or find new platforms, greater coverage, greater allies in the press and among politicians in order to keep a spotlight on the problem of the disappeared and the problem of the homicide rate, which is still terribly high, even though it is coming down somewhat.
And actually, I want to bring this back to something that actually I know would be a powerful interest to Victoria, and want to hit it a little harder, that the press matters. As obviously, you made a case in this whole thing. But the focus on the transitions and roles of the press, U.S. power is lurking in all of this. As I read the book, it hit me that in the transition from, shall we say, the defeat of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas in 86, right, to 94, Salinas obviously is playing a role in events that are promoting his upcoming presidency. And he's doing it in ways that, shall we say politely, the U.S. seems to have no grand concern with the continuation of the authoritarian ways of politics, with the destruction. The Mexican regime has often been described as authoritarian corporatist. He kept the authoritarianism while he corroded what had been the limited gains that had come through the corporatism to rural people, to labor, etc. And we had no problem with that, leading up to his victory in 94. And then I guess I want to conclude with something, because it comes right here to this building. I don't know how widely known it is. I don't know if anybody else in the room has been to Georgetown as long as I have been. But in the run up to the 2000 election, while you, in fact, were also here, a request came out of the White House to Georgetown University to host a campaign event on campus in English with Vicente Fox. Just so happened that the former head of Latin American Studies here, Arturo Valenzuela, was the head of the Latin America at the NSC at the time over there. It would have been hosted by the great Mexicanist political scientist John Bailey, but he was out of town at the time. So suddenly the request comes to the historian Tutino. Will you please set up and host an event in which Vicente Fox will come to Georgetown? Will be an event entirely in English in order to lobby the DC area US press to appreciate the importance of what Vicente Fox is bringing here. I'm set at 5 o'clock one afternoon. I'm sitting in my office upstairs waiting for it to happen. And a little after 4, my phone rings. And it tells me that Vicente Fox is in the building downstairs. Would I please join him for coffee? Well, I got my own private 45-minute lobbying case, an interview with Vicente Fox. Literally, when you go out for your refreshments at one of the tables in the atrium here, he was an incredibly pleasant guy, in part because my work was then focusing on Guanajuato and on the studies that came to focus on that it was really one of the places where global capitalism was founded. Well, he's real happy with that, that he is the has been the governor of this place, so important. So we got along just fine. We go over to the Copley to hold the event. And now I have to add something else in, though. His name didn't come up here today. One of the names that is repeatedly in your book as one of the independent voices is Miguel Ángel Granados Chapa. His son, Luis Fernando, had arrived here as a doctoral student the year before. So now we have Fox giving an interview with Granados Chapa's youngest, most radical child sitting in the audience. Everything is going on in English. Luis Fernando Granados listened politely and then asked the most challenging question of the day, all about the good for the global economy, the US, for Mexico. And Luis Fernando says, all the wonderful for the highly capitalist commercial Mexico, Mexico City, the Bajío North. What are you going to do for the people of Chiapas? What are you going to do for the people of Oaxaca, et cetera, et cetera? And for a brief moment, Vicente tripped over his tongue and offered them democracy and a chance to vote and moved on. All right. That could have ended it and it all would have been revealing in its own way. But as it wound down, Televisa is present and is recording all of this. But it comes up and says, it was wonderful. We recorded it all, but it's all in English. We can't use this in Mexico. They asked us, and we did, stage. After most of the audience left, we staged a repeat of about 20 minutes, everything in Spanish. Luis Fernando Granados stayed and tried his best to be a thorn in the side in Spanish as well. All of that staged at the interest of the US government in support of Fox's visit. I don't want to say it's the definitive win. Anyway, thank you all. There are refreshments outside. The conversation can carry on informally going forward. And again, thank you, Andrew.